Jade Audio is a subsidiary of FiiO. Here is their headphone, the JT1. FiiO offered me this headphone in exchange for my opinion, so let's get to it. Starting with the build and ergonomics, the first thing that should be obvious is the weight. At 303 grams, it feels lightweight for a full-size headphone, especially one with obviously many metal parts. The weight may give some the impression that it's not constructed well or lacks quality, but the reality is far from it. The tolerances are low and the parts are simple but well thought out. The headband suspension strap has a light but persistent elastic pull that does not apply pressure that is too strong or weak. You never feel like the headphone's trying to climb up your head or sag down from its own weight. The clamping force is about the same. The only part of the headband that may cause any concern is the complete lack of a swivel. Since there is no rotation, I think it's impossible to guarantee that it will comfortably fit every head out there. There are also two small hard foam buffers to stop the cups from noisily hitting the headband metal. In practice, though, this is more functional in protecting the cup cosmetics from mechanical damage. The cups are also very light and have a bit of a ring to them, which isn't perfect. Ideally, you want your best headphones to be acoustically dead, aside from the drivers, but that's not something most people should care about at this price point. The cups appear to be open back, as there is a grill pattern, but these are actually closed back headphones. More on that later. The cable sockets are standard 3.5mm TRS, so it should be very easy to use your own cables or replace it if needed. And the sockets are in the standard 6 o'clock position. So aside from the 5 pieces of text, these headphones are structurally symmetrical. The earpads appear to be made of the same pleather material that covers the suspension strap and also contains very light foam, which is extremely light and springy. This was very likely a design choice to make up for the lack of cup rotation, and as such, there should be no problems getting a good base seal. As a side note, I should mention that I tried rolling a bunch of other earpads on the JT1, and it was largely forgiving without deviating too much away from the original sound, so it should be relatively easy to find a 10cm diameter replacement pad for this headphone in the future, for comfort reasons or to replace worn out pads. The cable is about 1.5 meters long, it has a Y-split and is completely sheathed in synthetic fabric. All plugs are 3.5mm stereo TRS type, with the main plug being a TRRS type for the microphone. If your device does not support a TRRS microphone plug, you will have to purchase a splitter adapter to separate the headphone out and the microphone input, as no adapter is provided. But they're cheap, so it won't be a deal breaker for most people. The plugs all have metal housings and a very short rubber strain relief. I'm usually not a fan of fabric sheathed cables, as they are more prone to transferring friction noise, and these are no exception. Head movements will transfer more noise than average to the headphone. One thing I'm happy to see is that despite the fabric sheath, the cable remains very pliable. It's much easier to bend than some fabric-coated mouse cables I've used in the past, but it still has retained some shape memory from its storage in the packaging, which doesn't fully correct itself over time. I would have preferred to see the cable shipped out in a coil, rather than the more common, faster and easier back and forth wrapping method. Obviously FiiO's trying to keep costs low here, which is fine, but it seems to be a fairly high quality cable for this price point, and this packing method simply is not ideal for this cable type. Some nice touches, however, are the color-coded blue and red plugs, which match the blue and red color code for left and right channels. Also, when plugged in correctly, the FiiO logo faces forward away from you. As for the microphone's sound quality, I'll let you decide for yourself. This is the JT1 microphone when it's hanging down below my neck. And this is what it sounds like when I put the microphone up close to my mouth. This is what it sounds like when it's hanging around my neck. And this is what it sounds like in front of my mouth. Overall, the build quality is more than satisfactory. I just would have hoped for a more complete build with cup rotation. But for some people like myself, that won't be an issue. But for whatever reason, the depth of the pads combined with their extra soft foam allow me to wear these for hours on end with no discomfort, so I can only assume that this will be the case for many others. Now let's get to the fun part and take a look at the 50mm polyether ether ketone polyurethane composite with aluminium foil coated drivers. Is what I'd like to say, but there's a piece of foam glued to the baffle, hiding it. So let's just have a look inside and see what's going on in there instead. We can at least get a good look at the back of the drivers, and through the main vent, we can see that the driver is indeed a shiny metallic colour. The cups have been sealed with what appears to be a thick piece of card. I think we can safely assume that this headphone could well have been an open back in its development stage, and that changed at some point. In any case, there's definitely some modding potential here, which is going to appeal to some. I give both the build and ergonomics a well-deserved 8 out of 10. To get the easy stuff out of the way, the soundstage is good. It's not huge, but it's larger than average for a full-sized closeback. There are sounds that appear to escape from the space in your head, quite far from to the left and right, but imaging isn't great. Sounds extend well from the left and right, but the image remains on a relatively thin plane and doesn't spread out in front of you. For 3D gaming, where positional cues are helpful, this isn't a bad choice. You could do a lot worse. The detail is really good. I can't complain about that at all. I think some people would prefer a slightly stronger upper treble presence to bring out a bit more perceived detail and air, but it's never too strong or piercing and doesn't sound grainy or rough. The bass is the party piece of this headphone. It stands out as being bottomless, thunderous, and potentially overpowering. There are moments where it can sound boomy or unpleasant, but unfortunately that is entirely down to the recording, so it can be a bit of a mixed bag. Onto the mids, the general tuning of the headphone. This is where things actually get complicated. From an objective point of view, these headphones are kind of far from perfect. Of course, no headphone in this price segment can make that claim either of being perfect, but this headphone is something of an outlier. I need to pull up a frequency response graph to explain this more clearly. This graph was made using the mini DSP ears with compensation applied. The objectivists watching this will be tempted to turn off the video at this point, but I would suggest hanging around for a minute longer. The main thing people look for when reading these graphs is overall linearity and a lack of significant peaks and dips. But in my experience, this holds true for open back headphones only, with a big asterisk. When listening to a closed back headphone, there are actually some tuning tricks that can be used to make the headphone sound more clear, improve the sense of space, and the overall musical performance. Let's compare this graph briefly with 3 other headphones: the Biodynamic DT770 Pro, the SoundMagic HP100, and Rockjaw Acero. The most significant and obvious thing I have to point out is the dip between 100 and 300 Hz. Objectively, this looks like a bad idea, so why are so many closed-back headphones tuned like this? From all my listening experience, this is exactly where you want to put a dip, especially if you have a raised bass shelf, which all these headphones do have, at various degrees. The reason is because a bass shelf with a gradual mix into the mid-range will sound thick, boomy, and on the whole, quite distasteful. There are other headphones which try to use a dip in this way, like the Bowers & Wilkins P9 and the Meze 99 Classics, but they both start their dips higher, over 300 Hz and 200 Hz respectively. The former is a bloated boomy mess, while the latter just sounds a bit too thick depending on the genre and recording. This is the reason headphones like the DT770 Pro are still modern classics, and the Rockjaw Acero in its day found a small cult following. This is also the reason why I cannot hate the JT1. Looking at its overall frequency response, it's clear these are far from neutral. You could even go as far as describing these as having a W-shaped signature. A V-shaped signature is one where bass and treble are boosted, but the JT1 also has some kind of boosted aspect to the mid-range. If we ignore the whole roller coaster and focus on the general curve, it's mostly a pretty normal headphone with an extra strong bass shelf and a few lightly exaggerated frequencies, which is how most people who aren't objectivist, purist audiophiles will hear this. As a side note, It's important to note the dip around 3 to 4 kHz. Many headphones do this, open and closed alike. If this part of the headphone graph was completely flat, it would, or could, sound a bit harsh and shouty, so it's important to remember that a perfectly flat line actually doesn't always translate to a good sound to all human ears. The dip here is also often exaggerated by the mini DSP ears, which notoriously dips around 4 kHz with most closed-back headphone measurements. Also, in the case of the particular location of all these peaks and dips, it gives the impression of a much larger sound than you would get from a more accurately, neutrally tuned closed-back. You could call this kind of artificial soundstage or a psychoacoustic effect. So while objectively there's no way anyone should ever consider a headphone like this for recording or audio production, there's definitely a group of people out there who will prefer this sound profile and find it exciting. This tuning, however, does not lend itself to all genres. Basically, almost anything with an electronic beat will sound lively and fun. The bass shelf can sound quite good with some metal and hardcore music, although I noticed moments where it edged extremely close to being too boomy, and it was difficult to decide if I enjoyed it or not. It could just be that I found it a bit overwhelming. As tunings go, this one is undeniably extremely basshead oriented, albeit slightly fatiguing. Most people talk about headphone fatigue from piercing treble, but it's also easy to get the same feeling from bass that is about 10 decibels louder than the rest of the music. It's almost as if there's a low loudness filter constantly turned on in the headphone. To be clear, I can't recommend this headphone to everyone. The timbre quality is hyper-exaggerated. To make an analogy with digital photo processing, it's as if the saturation and contrast are turned up high. For a photograph, this can create a very impactful image in certain situations, but it's not true to life and not everyone will enjoy that. I found it especially difficult to enjoy this headphone with some classical music, where emotion and timbral reproduction accuracy is essential to conveying the emotions of the performers, but it did breathe new life into some especially bad recordings, like 1940s jazz. So the same should hold true for most genres with notoriously questionable mastering decisions, like Metallica's Master of Puppets, which is missing about 10 decibels in almost the entire bass region. The JT1 corrects a lot of those problems, but it's still not perfect. From an objective point of view, I can only give this a 5 out of 10, as detail and staging are both really good. From a subjective point of view, it gets an 8 out of 10 from me, as I find the bass a little overwhelming, even at lower volumes. Aside from the microphone, which is quite frankly a bit below average, this is the moment where gamers should feel bad about their last Razer Kraken V3X purchase. This is an example of what the average gaming headset looks like in comparison. No sub-bass, massively bloated and boomy mid-bass, horrendous mid-range tuning with massive holes 30 decibels quieter than the loudest bass, and a screaming upper mid-range and lower treble. If this headphone was a camera, it would only produce photos that look like unicorn poop. This is an absolute joke. So do your ears a favor and get something from a reputable audio company like FiiO instead. You'll have a headphone you can actually listen to music with, a headphone that isn't made entirely of plastic and marketing promises, and is not only a pleasure to listen to, but a pleasure to wear. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.